All right, today I'm really excited to be joined by Dr. Allessandria Polizzi. Welcome to the podcast, Al.
Thanks, Paul.
So first, a little bit about Al. Dr. Polizzi is a former HR executive, and she's now the CEO of Verdant Consulting. That's a top 20 workplace wellness provider of 2022. She is the ISO Global Liaison for Occupational Health and Safety. She also serves as an expert on psychological health and safety for professional associations, the media, and National Security Council. And she's recently published the Workplace Mental Health Strategy Workbook, designed to help companies proactively address this issue. Oh, and before we get into the topic today in any detail, there's a quick plug. Al and I are going to be co-presenting a deep dive on some of these topics in a live session that we've got coming up. So we'll be publicizing that a lot, but if you'd like an invite to attend or if you've got any questions for us, you can just email info@humanityworking.net. That's info@humanityworking.net. Whew, that was a lot of housekeeping. But anyway, all right, let's get into it. Al, there's a lot we could be diving into, but I think I want to start first on the very designation of mental health and mental health in the workplace. I remember listening a couple of years ago to a discussion about what people think of when they hear the terms physical health and what they think of when they hear the term mental health. That does conjure up very different images for people. Why do you think that is?
Because we're afraid of our feelings, but just said simply, I think, but we're going through a transition about this globally, Paul. In 2008, Australia, as you may know, they passed legislation that made psychologically abusive workplaces illegal and required that organizations track what are called the psychosocial hazards or hazards that can impact your mental health. And so the transition is changing from where we saw physical health, 50 years ago as an individual responsibility, no matter if they were injured on the job or not. Now, 50 years later, we're starting to see globally the perception that organizations are as responsible for any psychological health injuries that happen as a result of work and are responsible for protecting their workers' health, both physically and psychologically.
All right, I want to jump in on something that you said right off the bat there, because I think that's going to be a surprise to a lot of people. You mentioned that in Australia, that it is basically effectively illegal to have a workplace that is not psychologically safe. So I think I've had a conversation with several people recently, and the first question that they have associated with that is, how is that even possible? Right. So, and I know that you've done a lot of work on this. So,
right?
So explain.
Well, first of all, let's just pause on that. Let's just tease that apart. The fact that we think it's impossible to have a workplace that's not psychologically healthy or safe is in and of itself the problem. So somehow we have created a world in which you almost have to be abused in order to, be worthy of compensation in some way. And so how they've done it is through science. We have decades, almost 100 years worth of research on what causes people to burn out, have anxiety, increased risk of depression, and other damage as a result of the workplace. This has been studied very clearly for a while. And we know there are approximately 12 what are called psychosocial hazards. The World Health Organization lists those, the Australian standard, the Canadian standard, and of course the ISO standard all list these. And so they're known hazards that have been shown to increase the likelihood of psychological distress. Just like we know, ergonomics is important for us not getting repetitive injury. If you would have told that to someone 100 years ago, they would have thought that was laughable. Why would a company be responsible for how you sit at your desk, right? But yet they see the benefit to having healthy workers. And so if we think about health as total health, which includes our bodies and minds, there are impacts that happen as a result of work that can be either prevented or mitigated. And that's the requirement in Australia.
Got it. Yeah, I mean, I think part of the challenge here, at least in a lot of people's minds about this stuff, is how often apparently invisible some of these things are. There's an amazing statistic that you call out in the book. 75% of employees witness bullying, and 20% of workers report being bullied at work. 20% report being bullied at work. So it makes you wonder what the actual
Mm-hmm.
number is. I
Mm-hmm.
can tell you that in my past, I was bullied at work. I never reported it. So and I'm sure I'm sure there are many people that did not. And you put a cost in there as well. The cost being 2.6 trillion. That's $1 trillion. So there is this aspect of, I don't know if you like, almost ubiquity to it, which you point out, which is sort of ingrained in our in opinions that we have about this stuff. And then I suppose there's the other aspect of this, which is how for many people this is something that is happening on a individual basis, and it could be a relationship between an individual employee and an individual boss, or of an employee and a coworker, and it's happening in some cases behind closed doors, and it doesn't look the same as when somebody breaks your leg, right? So there is this sort of like, how do you legislate for something that is in so many cases invisible or close to invisible?
Yeah, well, many physical ailments are also invisible to the human
That
eye,
is true.
right? So you don't necessarily see cancer or
Mm-hmm.
cardiovascular disease or even muscle strain, which interestingly, 30% of musculoskeletal injury on the job, according to OSHA, is a result of the lack of psychological safety. So, in other words, if I don't ask for help because I don't want to look weak, and then I become injured, or we have an unreasonable workload, so I'm rushing through things, I'm more highly likely to become injured. So we see physical injury as a result of the lack of psychological safety
Mm-hmm.
as well. And so, it's kind of like the conversation we have around harassment and other behavior based requirements within the workplace. You know it when you see it,
Yeah.
but there are measures. So that is actually one of the number one questions that I get when I mention to people what I do is, well, how in the heck are you going to measure that? And easily, because we know what the hazards are. Just like, so for example, I can measure the number of the risk of physical injury based on how many ladders are used at a work site. Does that mean I have to wait for someone to fall and become physically harmed before I do anything? No, because I can put these measures into place that are preventative and proactive. And the other piece that is this mindset shift we really need to make is that somehow we have to trade off financial viability of an organization for human viability of an organization. And yet every single research study that's ever been done shows that healthy humans drive healthy business. So if we think that we have to have unhealthy humans in order to achieve our goals, we aren't doing it right. And it's definitely not going to be sustainable.
Yeah, and you bring up a point which actually is sort of where I'd love to take this conversation, right? This, as far as you're concerned, this is really an issue of health and safety, right?
Mhm. Yeah, it's a health and safety issue. It's a leadership issue. And when I say leadership issue, I want to be really clear because I
Mm-hmm.
have a slightly nuanced perspective around leadership. This is not to shame leaders for being terrible. And we know that 83% of them, according to Gallup, are.
Mm-hmm.
So this is to say we don't equip leaders with the skills to navigate this terrain. And spoiler alert, the ones who have the most mental health risk are the leaders. The higher up you go, the more likely it is that you've developed some kind of psychological injury. And in fact, one study showed that about 78% of people VP and above have a mental health issue or a symptom of a mental health issue. And the fact that data isn't necessarily that that's pretty darn surprising. It's that it's not surprising to most people I share it with.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Somehow we feel like that's acceptable. Yeah, no, that checks out, and this is totally working.
Yeah, and you bring out this. There's a piece I love in the book. It's called a dangerous past changes in workplace safety, and what you do there is you kind of point out significant dates as to when pieces of legislation have effectively been passed in the realm of health and safety, and as you get towards the year 2000, you get towards, for example, 1999 is where this stress at work research was published, and 1999 is when is the publication of the ISO 18001 standard, which was for those people that know this field will know that that was republished as ISO 45001. Um, it's a really interesting reminder that I'm going to say something that's pretty obvious, I think here, but the work and workplace conditions are not the same as they always were, and that they are continuously evolving. And so, I think when you look through that, you see kind of the logical place that this follows in terms of our of putting this more front and center. But interestingly, it's also true. You point this out as well that it's not just for the last 5 or 10 years or 20 years that people have been thinking about the psychological problems and the psychological health of a workforce. You have a quote by Henry Metcalf in there from 1927.
Yeah,
I mean, it's
yeah.
crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. I love that. I love to look at. We've been talking about this for 100 years, right?
Yeah.
And again, the spoiler alert: we see that higher performance from businesses that have healthier workers. And so, what does that mean? That means that they're healthy in both body and mind. And that does not mean that we are coddling people. It doesn't mean that people don't want to work. It doesn't mean we're lowering the bar. The opposite is true. People want to do good work. Like to be productive. In fact, one of the data points I like to share on that is that there is a bigger risk to our mental health than burnout, and it's called bore out.
Yeah.
So being bored is actually more detrimental to our mental health than being overworked and burned out, because as humans, we enjoy achieving, we enjoy creating, we enjoy challenges and overcoming challenges. Those are things that we seek out. Now, we can talk about capitalism and what it's done to our sense of what worth is, but it's a different conversation for a different time. However, the belief that somehow people are inherently lazy is not actually proven out in any of the research or data.
All right. Related to that, then let's bust a myth. Young people today are lazy and weak. Discuss.
You, I think I listed a quote that was from I think the 1800s regarding people
You
not
did.
wanting to work in mines.
Yeah.
So there's this perception that there's another one that I think is worth exploring, which is, well, no one ever did this to me and I'm okay.
Yeah.
Well, you might be okay, but you're not as good as you could be. And the other here's the question I love to ask executives is to tell me when you've done your best work.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason I ask that question is, to the person, they never talk about when they made the most money. They never talk about when they had the best title. What they talk about is when my boss trusted me, I felt valued, I worked with a team where we trusted each other and depended on each other. They talk about their feelings right away. Right
Uh-huh.
away, they talk about their feelings when I ask when you did your best work. And so, what we are trying to do is help most people do their best work on most days. And what we see is that is more productive and more effective for businesses across innovation, performance, quality, customer service. You tell me the metric, I can tell you how having healthy workers helps you achieve it.
Yeah. So we haven't really we've talked about this as a workplace safety issue. I guess that when we're thinking this thing through, there's probably a misconception that we kind of need to break through, which is there are many organizations, I think many organizations out there right now, that if you ask them a question as to whether they prioritize the mental health of their employees, they would answer in the affirmative. And the reason that they would answer in the affirmative would be because they have an employee access assistance program, the EAP, that provides people potentially with, I don't know, free mental health benefits or access to counseling or some or even a psychologist or psychiatrist. Maybe they've worked with their related to that, but maybe they've worked with the insurance company to make sure that those benefits are prioritized and all that kind of stuff. And in addition to that, maybe they've instituted some really strong policies inside the company that allow people to speak up against things like when they are being bullied in the workplace and so on and so forth. But I'm getting from the discussion here is that that's not the whole story. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, so one, as you mentioned in the beginning, I used to be a chief people officer, and when I was a CPO, I was working in the veterinary industry, which is the fourth highest industry for death by suicide.
Yeah.
And in fact, my first week on the job, we had one of our team members threatening to end her life, and we had to intervene, which was new for me. I had just come from working in craft beer. So, and before that, Slurpees. So this was all new for me. And so I quickly became QPR certified. So I know what I did as a CPO. I would not do that today. And what I did as a CPO is I doubled down on my EAP, right? And I raised awareness around our EAP because I only was focusing on people in crisis. The problem with only focusing on people in crisis is it's the same thing as only going to the doctor when you're having a heart attack. So if we think about health and safety and as both psychological and physical, we want to proactively implement what the World Health Organization rolled out in 2022, which is we want to prevent injury as a result of the workplace, which means we make sure that the ways in which we're working are healthy. We want to equip people with skills to navigate challenges, which most people don't learn outside of the workplace. And then we want to support people when they're in crisis. But those first two things need to happen because mental health is a continuum, and we all have it. We all have mental health needs, and we all have the ability to learn new skills that help us navigate challenges. So what I would say, and the reason I actually wrote the book was I see a lot of my HR brothers and sisters putting solutions in place without a strategy. And that's fine. I did it too. We implemented an app solution. I won't mention the brand as part of our support for our practices. And it had very little impact, which has been shown to be the case. But what I didn't have was a strategy around workplace mental health. And so when I can think about, well, what if I look at it holistically, then I can become preventative, I can embed it in how we work, and I can therefore have better outcomes that are tied back to the business.
Yeah, and there's a few stats that you call out that I think really kind of illustrate exactly what you're talking about. You mentioned that it takes 7 to 8 years on average for people to seek help. So if you think about the impact on your business, just purely like if you take away the sort of human aspect of this, the human tragedy of this, frankly, if you take even that away, just think about that idea that 7 to 8 years before you seek help, that's 7 to 8 years of suboptimal performance from those people.
Yeah.
And then,
also, you're sorry, go ahead. I love
well, I
it
was
when I
just going
can
to say,
just
and
sit
then
here and
also
have you quote me.
2 out of 3 never seek it. 2 out of 3 people never seek the help.
No, they don't. And in certain populations, communities, the stigma is so strong that it's even less likely that they would seek it, right?
Yeah.
And also, there's been research that psychological health and safety unlocks some of the benefits of the work that people are already doing. So let's talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. It is shown that I am less likely to speak up in the workplace as a diverse member of that population if I don't have psychological safety. So psychological safety increases the likelihood that this hard-won talent actually feels comfortable speaking up, which in my mind reflects inclusion and belonging. So without that, they're less likely to participate.
So on the topic of different cultures, let's think about a little bit about the U.S. compared, for example, to other countries. We started this conversation with your discussion about what's happening in Australia. I know even the US picture is not uniform. I know there are different activities that are happening in different states and so on, and even there are dramatic differences in uptake of the APs, for example, in different parts of the United States. But there's a quote on the back of the book which I think is really interesting, which is the United States is at least a decade, maybe more, behind those who could be considered global leaders in addressing psychological health and safety. Whilst waiting for a mandate is an option, those looking to address this issue because it's simply the right thing to do will find this workbook helpful. So, um,
I love Dr. Daniels.
yeah, yeah. So it is it's a great quote, but I'm curious as to what you think the why is behind that. Why is the U.S. a decade or more behind those that could be considered global leaders in addressing psychological health and safety, particularly because the economic costs associated with that are so substantial? Why would the U.S. be lagging in the way that it is?
Um, Gosh, I wish I had a really crisp and bite-sized response to that. I don't. I can tell you what I've observed. So let's just talk about what's happened globally. So as I
Mm-hmm.
mentioned, Australia has their legislation in place since 2008. Same with Canada. They have had their guidelines in place since 2000, the same time. And a lot of the global standards are actually based on the Canadian standard that they implemented. And the World Health Organization and the International Labor Organization published their guidelines for workplace mental health in 2022. And then ISO, of course, did their standard in 2021. So globally, we're seeing this movement happening outside the United States. In the United States, we have psychological safety legislation in process in 32 states. And it actually has gone to move forward the most in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, which is probably not surprising. Um, but what's my hypothesis on why we're behind? Well, no matter where you land on the political spectrum, you may have noticed that we've been a little distracted here in the United States. And doing things together has not been a strong suit for us. We are not exactly as united as perhaps we have been in the past. So there's a lot of things that are slipping behind as a result of that. I mean, think about the backlash happening right now when it comes to DEI, even
Mm-hmm.
in the United States. So there's a lot of cultural transitions, I would call it, that have been happening here in the last, oh, you can put your finger on whenever, but uh, we've been a little distracted. I think also there's this kind of rugged individualism mindset, up by your bootstraps mindset, tough it out mindset that makes talking about feelings scary, and somehow the equivalent of needing to cry at work. I hear this a lot. Well, I
Mm-hmm.
don't want to have to talk about my feelings or about crying at work. And that's not what we're talking about at all. You never have to talk
Mm-hmm.
about your feelings. You never have to cry at work. You never have to open up about your childhood trauma in order to have a psychologically healthy workplace. What you do need is to be able to navigate your own stuff so that it doesn't blow up in the face of your team. What you do need is the ability to recognize when you're being activated and triggered so you don't have it negatively impact your team or yourself. And you do need to be able to recognize dysfunctional ways of working that hinder capacity and the ability for people to do their best work. None of that is about sharing anything vulnerable. It's about understanding how humans are wired.
So that sounds, I think, probably for a lot of our listeners, that will sound something similar to emotional intelligence. But I know again that you would argue that it's not that's not the whole picture either.
Mhm.
So talk about that, because for I think for a lot of people they think if I understand what emotional intelligence is and if I can get in touch with my own feelings and maybe I don't know I've done a half-hour course on it or something like that, then suddenly all of
You're
this
good.
is
I am so
problematic. Yeah,
good.
we're
I
good.
know.
So
So most people would say, I don't want to do that because I'm afraid of what I might find. So
yep.
that's the response I get about self-reflection from leaders. And So I prefer emotional agility over emotional intelligence. Here's why. One, emotional intelligence assumes we all come from similar backgrounds where we have the capacity to navigate things in a healthy way. and we don't necessarily. Trauma is pretty pervasive across various societies and communities. In fact, 2/3 of the adult population in the United States had at least one traumatic childhood event. And as we know, that changes how our brains are structured.
Mm-hmm.
So I am not as much of a fan of emotional intelligence. I don't judge it. Lots of people in my affiliate group practice emotional intelligence, but I think we can do more than be intelligent about it. I think there's about being agile. And so in being agile, that means we understand that some days we feel bad. Some days are going to be difficult, and we know how to navigate those, not control them.
Mm. And then I suppose related to that, to a certain extent, that and strategies that leaders might adopt might include you could call it relentless positivity,
Oh God,
or
no. No. Stop.
or some people
Stop
might
right
call
now.
it toxic positivity.
Stop it
But
right now.
talk to me about that.
Stop it right now. So, like, I actually have a book on my shelf that somebody got me when I was a CPO called Chief Joy Officer. And I
Oh
keep it
dear.
up. Yeah, I know. So just remember all the happiness. And then we were like, oh, I'm happy. That's not the goal. You don't
Yeah.
learn as much when you're just happy all the time. And that's called a lobotomy. So I don't mean that in a strict scientific way. But
Right.
anyway, my point being that we are whole creatures. We are feeling creatures who also think. We have lots of feelings, not just joy and not just happiness and not just anger. So getting to understand the very nuanced way in which we experience the world makes us healthier and better able to bounce back from challenges. This is why when we first started launching our programs, the first thing we launched was a resiliency training,
Yeah.
because there are skills that we need to know, especially as leaders, but even as individual contributors, about how we show up, our self-verification, our biases, our self-criticism, and the opportunities to apply and employ these tactics that have been scientifically researched for decades to be more healthy and more productive. And so building those skill sets, I call it how to human at work. There's really not another platform in which we can learn those skills. We're not taught how to operate our brains that have evolved in 200,000 years to survive. And so instead we kind of white knuckle through it, and then we kind of positive vibes only, and it's incredibly unhealthy.
How to human at work. What a wonderful statement for a podcast called Humanity Working. But, yeah. So let's shift gears a little bit. I'd love to talk a little bit about some of the things that are changing work right now, and what the response to that has been, and how we go about dealing with that. And firstly, a fairly obvious one, the pandemic. So you mentioned, obviously, traumatic events that have happened in people's lives. Well, we've all been through something that has been traumatic, and for many of us, extremely traumatic. People might have lost a family member. Children, of course, lost a whole bunch of in-person schooling. And, in our work, we've been working increasingly with educational institutions and talking to them about what is, they can see the real data associated with this. They can see the grades, they can see, attendance, they can see, all these various things that they can measure, and they can see a significant shift that happened associated with COVID. But I'm curious, what have you seen in your work, and what do you think it means for, as we're working our way through the impact of COVID, what does it mean for the work, for the measures that organizations need to take?
Yeah. So what's interesting about things like the Psychological Health and Safety Standard, which is ISO 45003 for our ISO nerds, is that started in 2019. Had nothing to do with the pandemic.
Yeah.
It was developed agnostic of a global pandemic. But there are things I think that are important for us to think about when it comes to the humans at work related to trauma. And I know that trauma is a scary word, and this isn't about asking people about their trauma. This is about being informed about the impact that trauma can have on our workplaces and our workers, and how we can create workplaces that are healthier. And those fall into a couple of buckets. Number one, during the pandemic, actually, the World Health Organization and CDC were talking about the second pandemic of a mental health crisis. This was early days, 2020, 2021, early, before we actually started to see this come to fruition, because we know that people who experience natural disasters, and there's been tons of studies. My favorite one of the bigger ones is one that's looked at 64,000 survivors of different natural disasters, things like the tsunami in Indonesia, the earthquake in Mexico City. And they saw that up to 40% of the population of people who experience those natural disasters had PTSD symptoms up to 2 years following.
Hmm.
When we started doing the research following the pandemic, my mother currently has COVID right now, actually. We saw that about 35% of the US population was experiencing those post-traumatic symptoms. And actually, the biggest threat to our mental health is climate change.
Hmm.
Because if we want to extend, the natural disasters have a negative impact or put us at risk for that post-traumatic stress response, and natural disasters are exponentially increasing as a result of climate change.
Hmm.
This is going to continue to grow and develop on the impact it will have on our employees, and on our workplaces in general. Additionally, we have an entire generation that had a traumatic childhood event called COVID. So as this next generation enters the workplace, 99.9% of them, as you said, from educators that are already seeing this, I have friends who teach college, um, they are coming to the workplace with trauma. And
Hmm.
the analogy I like to use when I teach this topic is, if you here in the US, if you had a grandparent or relative who went through the Great Depression,
Hmm.
we all have those
Yep.
stories of them saving the foil tins from the frozen dinners, right?
Hmm.
Right? Because they have this mindset that was established when they were children. And so now we have 100% of the population that went through that. And so there are specific things we should know about how that shows up at work. Not that we have to give excuses for bad behavior or lower the standards or anything like that. It is more about understanding it so that we can create ways of working that are more healthy and productive, quite frankly, for everyone, trauma informed or not.
Now let's talk about a couple of other changes and challenges that people are facing right now. So the two that spring to mind are one, work from anywhere, if you want to call it that, or the shift to flexible work styles, the shift out of a formal office setting and formal days and times when people work. And then the second one, of course, that's impacting a lot of people right now is the massively rapid adoption of AI. So in both of those cases, what we've seen through our work is that these are adding to feelings. In some cases, they're adding to feelings of like ambiguity in the workplace, and I don't know what success looks like, and I don't really understand how I'm going to be successful as a human being. Plus, of course, anxiety associated with with job security and all of that kind of stuff as well. We kind of break it down into what we call change fatigue and change anxiety. So change fatigue being like, this is just tiring, all this change, and
Mm-hmm.
change anxiety being, I don't really know what it means for me. I don't really know what it means for my team or my organization or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So are you seeing similar things in your work as well around those two issues?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, AI in and of itself, just by itself, is an existential crisis.
Yeah.
Um, in concert with climate change, it just keeps we keep piling on all of these
Yeah.
challenges on our employees, and we don't have a work brain and an outside work brain. We have just the one brain. So all of these things, they come to work with us, and so they can be distractions. They can cause us to be more exhausted. They can impact our ability to focus pretty heavily. And so I think if we pretend like people can just shut it off or leave it at the door, that's not actually a real thing. And so it definitely shows up at work. I think the other one is, it's not just about work from anywhere. It's also this forced return to the office.
Yeah.
And one of the things that's considered a psychosocial hazard is the lack of choice and control.
Mm.
And so when you're being forced to work in a place, especially if you've developed maybe some neuroses around health and safety or germs or coughing or the things
Mm.
like that, as a result of the pandemic, these things can impact us. And quite frankly, the demand to return to the office is not based on any data or any
Yep.
research about productivity or financial benefit. In fact, there's a woman also out of Australia, who did a study looking at forced return to office and those who kept it open, and they saw the ones that kept it open had better financial returns, better Glassdoor ratings. So there's just no correlation. But here we are. What it is being driven by fear and control. And fear and control is what has been the evolutionary directive for our brains on how do we stay safe. And so when we see those manifest in ways that are dysfunctional, like this, that's where, boy, if we knew more about how our brains work, maybe we wouldn't be going in that direction.
Yeah, beautifully said. And then you've touched, obviously, a little bit on the climate crisis already in terms of the impact it will have of natural disasters, et cetera. But of course, particularly for younger people that are entering into the workforce right now and can effectively project forward, there is also, in many cases, some almost existential angst
Mm-hmm.
associated with that. And so, do you see differences in terms of how different generations are viewing that threat?
Yeah, it's not just generational, it's also where's my area of focus. So
Yeah.
your scientists, folks who are working on climate, climate change or climate justice, experience something called climate anxiety.
Hmm.
And it's becoming more and more of a threat to our mental health. Like I said, the World Health Organization considers climate change a mental health threat as much
Yeah.
as it is a threat to other parts of our lives. And so again, this is not going to be going away.
Yeah. All right. I want to finish this up with something that's a little bit more forward-looking and hopefully a little bit more upbeat, as it were. Um, Although, I mean, it's fascinating getting into the weeds and dealing with all the
Well,
challenges.
let me hold on before we move on.
Yeah.
So the good news is we're talking about this stuff now,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
We aren't gaslighting ourselves into thinking there's something wrong with me. I mean, that's the biggest response I get when I talk about these things is people saying, "Oh, I thought it was just me. I thought
Yeah.
I was the broken one." And when we can understand that these are things that have been well documented, and even for leaders, right? Knowing that imposter syndrome and masking and loneliness are common, very common, and almost to be expected, then, oh, I'm not broken for having had those feelings. And now I know I can do something about it. So, in my mind, yes, we're talking about relatively dark topics, but they've been here. It's just about how are we going to address it in a way that's more healthy. And I'm pretty excited about what's happening with that globally myself.
Wonderful. And that actually leads me directly. That's a beautiful segue into my last question, which is, as you've mentioned, that right from the start, right? There are countries that are doing this really well. There are companies that are doing this really well here in the United States already. So it's not all, it's not everything here is terrible in the in the United States either. So what I'd love to hear is, this is almost like a two-part question. So the first part to the question is, I'd love to hear a fairly succinct example of what great looks like today. And then the second aspect of this, if we just fast forward even 10 years, let's say to 2034. So I'll be pretty much retired by then, hopefully, if everything's if everything's on track. But if I were looking at those companies, what would be different about the average company in the United States as a result of the work that we're doing here?
Yeah. So I think the thing that I have seen being most successful is to start by understanding what the hazards are within your specific workplace and industry. So doing the assessment, which is relatively easy lift. There's 12 psychosocial hazards can identify, and you can measure those pretty clearly, and then putting mitigations in place so
Mm-hmm.
that we're monitoring them. So that's number one. Number two is we've equipped leaders with the skills so that they can both make sure that they stay healthy, and that they can create and emulate certain behaviors that create resiliency and the ability to navigate challenges, because
Mm-hmm.
change is not slowing down. It's
Yeah.
it's not slowing down, and that we also equip our teams with those skills as well. And then of course we have support mechanisms where needed for people who are in crisis or not well. So that's the framework that the World Health Organization rolled out It works, and every organization that we've partnered with, they've all had insights on, believe it or not, relatively easy things that they can change that make work better. As a result of that, they have deeper conversations, actually more conflict, because it's healthy conflict, more disagreement, more discussion, more iteration, ability to be agile. And so, what does that look like in the future? I think we have more innovative and more highly productive organizations where people can just do their best work, and we can keep up with the technology. Because here's the thing, we are not going to out machine AI,
Yeah.
but we can out human it. And so that's the part that we have to embrace, is the part that makes us unique and special. And unfortunately for us, that's the softer side.
Yeah. Well, that's a wonderful point at which to leave it. Thank you so much, Al. A reminder for everybody that Al and I will be going to some of the topics that we've discussed here in a little bit more detail. I think we're probably going to be going into the leadership aspect of this in a little bit more detail as well. So a reminder again, that will be a live event. So if you want to register for that, just email at us info@humanityworking.net. That's info@humanityworking.net. And if you have any questions that you'd like us to address, then obviously send questions to that as well. Really looking forward to that discussion, and thank you so much for your time today, Al.
Thanks for having me, Paul. Appreciate it.
Thank you.